philosophy, ethics, and the history of political thought. Nigel's work has been widely published in academic journals, and he has authored several books, including In Defense of War, Between King and Cosmopolis, and Ethic of the Nation, and more recently, Colonialism, A Moral Reckoning. Apart from his academic work, Nigel is known for engaging in public debates on sensitive and controversial topics, including colonialism, imperialism, and the moral evaluation of historical figures. His views have sometimes sparked controversy and debate, as he has advocated for a nuanced understanding of historical figures and events, taking into account both their positive and negative aspects. So today he's here to talk about one of those controversial topics, namely colonialism. Welcome, Nigel.
Thanks, Ivan. And thanks for the introduction. And so I'll speak for, I don't know, 30, 35 minutes. I guess we've got an hour and a half to play with. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay. So I'll leave plenty of time for open discussion. And as we agreed earlier, feel free to interject if you're so moved. So a bit more about me, just so you know where I'm coming from. My first degree was in modern history here at Oxford. I then became a theologian with an interest particularly in ethics, and my ethical focus has been on political matters. So I've written on the ethics of making peace and doing justice after civil conflict. I've written, as Ivan said, on the ethics of war under the title of In Defense of War, also on the ethics of national loyalty in a book called Between Kin and Cosmopolis, An Ethic of the Nation. Until my book on colonialism, published in February of this year in this country and in May of this year in your country, my last book was called What's Wrong with Rights, with a question mark at the end of the title, published in 2020. So I've long had an interest in analyzing complex political issues, of which colonial history is one. Let me talk about the genesis of the book that appeared this year, why I wrote it, and its rocky progress toward publication, which will engage issues of free speech and the so-called cultural wars. Then I will simply summarize the main argument in the book. Maybe I'll tell you, since I don't presume you read it, I'll give you an outline of what it covers and then summarize the main argument. And then if time remains, I can comment on the reception of the book so far. So why did I write this book? I'm both English and Scottish. I was born in Scotland to a Scottish father, English mother, educated in England. When the referendum on Scottish independence and therefore on whether the United Kingdom should disintegrate was held in 2014, I was a visceral unionist. I was viscerally opposed to Scottish independence, but I felt morally obliged to expose myself to arguments on the other side and to look at the case for Scottish independence. And so I read a number of nationalist accounts of Scottish independence. And one argument I came across can be distilled into the following equation. Britain equals empire equals evil. Therefore, Scotland needs to secede from the United Kingdom in order to purify itself and enter a bright, new, shiny, sin-free future. I speak as a partisan, and my language is chosen accordingly. And since although I'm not a professional historian, my first love and my last love has always been history. I read history all the time, and I've been reading British imperial history for 30 years since I knew something on the topic, I knew that the equation empire equals evil does not stand. And so I was invited to visit the British government's Secretary of State for Defence to talk about Britain's nuclear deterrent, which is based in Scotland, and the threat the Scottish independence poses to it in, I think, 2016. For those of you who don't remember or don't know, the referendum on Scottish independence was lost to the nationalists, so the UK remains as it was. But I was asked to go and talk to the Secretary of State about Scottish nationalism and the threat to Britain's nuclear deterrent. And I remember when I left his office, he said, well, what are you doing next? And I think I said, I'm thinking about writing a book on colonial history, British colonial history, because the Scottish referendum had alerted me to the fact that this issue is politically powerful. It was part of the armory that could have led to the disintegration of the UK. And then since then, it's become even more politically powerful. In 2020, as you will well know, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. Black Lives Matter enjoyed a resurgence in your country, and then because in my country we often seem to forget we're not American, it arrived over here, and the equivalent of your 1619 project, which has it that the foundations of America are racist. The equivalent here is that Britain is systemically racist, and that our systemic racism stems from our continuing reverence for our colonial past, whose epitome was slavery and the abhorrent racial contempt for Africans that justified it. Therefore, we need to pull down statues and repudiate colonial history in order to free ourselves from our systemic racism. And my view is that both of the main tenets of this decolonizing narrative are false. Britain is not systemically racist, even though it contains elements of racism, and that Britain's colonial history cannot be reduced to slavery, not least because the second half of the British Empire's life was devoted to suppressing slavery from Brazil across the Atlantic, Africa, India, and Malaysia. So no, colonialism and slavery are not the same thing. They're not identical. But this decolonizing story has swept through our institutions, and it threatens to infect us in this country with what I call the canker of imaginary guilt. This is not my phrase. This is the phrase used by the Baghdad-born Jewish historian Eli Kaduri, who in 1976 published a book called The Anglo-Arab Labyrinth. And in this book, in chapter 7, I think he wrote this. He said, no doubt, great powers do commit great crimes, but a great power is not always and necessarily in the wrong. And the canker of imaginary guilt, even the greatest power can ill withstand. Now, the guilt that Kaduri was concerned with was the conviction that the British had betrayed the Arabs after the First World War in allowing Jewish immigration into Palestine, having allegedly promised the Arabs Palestine as part of a new Arab state. And Kaduri argues convincingly, I think, that the British made no such promise. Nevertheless, the canker of imaginary guilt, according to Kaduri, had infected the British Foreign Office and British foreign policy. So today, it seems to me that we in Britain, and indeed in Canada and Australia and New Zealand, are suffering a fresh wave of the canker of imaginary guilt, which is determining the decisions and policies of our cultural institutions. It's making us vulnerable to infinite claims of reparation for historic wrongs. So my motive for writing this book was strengthened after 2020. Now, just to roll back slightly, I'd already begun to think that this topic of empire and colonialism was really publicly important, and so in 2017, I joined up with the eminent historian of empire globally, British Empire also, but more generally empire globally, John Darwin here in Oxford, and we launched the Ethics and Empire project in July 2017, and this was designed to take the form of 5 annual conferences covering empire from ancient China to the modern period, and exploring what contemporaries thought of empire, morally speaking. So what did ancient Chinese people think about empire, morally speaking? And the model for critical reflection on empire was St. Augustine's City of God, published or written in the early 400s in response to the pagan Roman claim that the Christians had been responsible for the collapse of the Roman Empire, at least in Italy. And Augustine wrote an account of Roman Empire that was critical. And so what were the equivalent Chinese, ancient Chinese or medieval Muslim equivalents of critical reflection on empire? Parenthetical comment here. What was interesting was we couldn't find any because it seemed that to ancient Chinese and medieval Muslims, empire was such a normal feature of life that the only question was, is the emperor virtuous or vicious? What makes for a good or a bad emperor? Empire as such was completely unremarkable. Anyway, so we launched this in 2017, and in November 17, I published an article in the London Times, which made what I thought to be the completely incontrovertible, rather anodyne statement that we British can find cause for both pride and shame in our colonial history. And then a few days later, I published online an account of the Ethics and Empire project. And that provoked a sudden reaction. I was in Heathrow Airport preparing to fly to Germany to celebrate my wedding anniversary with my wife, and I got notice from the Oxford University authorities that a group of students had published an online denunciation of the Ethics and Empire project. That was on the Thursday. On the Sunday, my historian collaborator John Darwin resigned from the project. On the Tuesday, a second online protest was published, this time signed by 58 Oxford scholars, most of them junior. And then on the Thursday, I think there was another letter addressed to my university calling its support of my project into question, urging the university to take control of it, and signed by about 200 academics worldwide. And I subsequently learnt, because I saw the Twitter correspondence, and I have a screenshot of this one, that this series of 3 online denunciations was launched by a Cambridge academic, Priyambada Gopal, a reader in post-colonial literatures, who, upon reading the online description of the Ethics and Empire project, tweeted her followers, and I quote verbatim, "OMG, oh my God, this is serious shit. We need to, block capitals, shut this down." So that's when I got plunged into the culture wars. Contrary to what people on the left say, no, the culture war and colonialism, in my experience, is not an invention of the right. It's a creation of, in my experience, of left-wing aggression, some left-wing aggression. I didn't expect it. I didn't want it. It came to me. To cut a long story short, and I can talk more about my experience and what I've observed from it if you want. I mean, I learned that I learned there's a distinction between what prevail the common sense that prevails in universities and the common sense that prevails outside of them. I learned that not all non-white people think the same thing. Why would they? Some of them agree with me. But one of the upsides was in April 18, I was encouraged to think about writing An Intelligent Person's Guide for Colonialism by Bloomsbury Publishing, who gave me a contract. In December 2020, I produced the 135,000-word manuscript with 9 hours to spare before the deadline dropped. Early 2021, my publisher, having read the manuscript, wrote that he was speechless with admiration for my book's rigor and comprehensiveness. He said twice it was an important book, and he predicted sales of between 15 and 20,000 copies. It went into copy editing. They produced a cover, but then in March 2021, I received an email from the top of Bloomsbury Publishing announcing that they decided to postpone publication indefinitely because, quote, public feeling is unfavorable. I was very upset, both for personal reasons and I think more for public reasons, actually, because the thought that we in Britain had come to the place where what someone else with experience judged to be an important book, what just someone else judged to be commercially viable on a topic of high public importance could not be published because public feeling was judged by some to be unfavorable. But since I had no alternative, I didn't let. I was told that Bloomsbury wanted me to walk away from the contract. I didn't do that. I didn't want to make it easy for them. So I engaged in some innocent correspondence, and I asked questions like, so you think public feeling is unfavorable? Well, there's lots of public feeling out there, and it doesn't all feel the same thing. Which one are you worried about? To which no clear answer came. And next, you say public feelings are unfavorable, and you're postponing publication. So when do you think you might unpostpone publication? When might conditions become favorable again? Again, no clear response. And then in April, I got a letter saying, we're sure you're keen to get this published, but so you can have your contract back and go elsewhere, in effect. Fortunately, HarperCollins, William Collins, the hardback non-fiction imprint of HarperCollins, picked up what Bloomsbury jettisoned in August 21, and the book came out in this country in early February and came out in your country in early May. So the end of the story is a happy one. So that's the story of how we got to where we are in terms of the book. And I'll be happy to talk about academic freedom, culture wars, and what can be done about it. There are some really positive signs on this side of the Atlantic that I can tell you about. But let me not dwell any more on that. Let me talk about the book itself. So this is not Colonialism, a Moral Reckoning, as the subtitle indicates, is not a history book. It's a moral accounting. I'm an ethicist, professionally, not an historian. But of course, I decided to focus on the British Empire because I know it best, and because there's plenty to sink our ethical teeth into there. And the British Empire was, of all the European empires, I think the most far-flung and largest and most powerful, at least up until the First World War. So the book falls into 8 main chapters, just to remind myself. Chapter 1 on motives, chapter 2 on slavery, 3 on racism, 4 on land, 5 cultural assimilation and genocide, 6, free trade, investment and exploitation, 7, government and nationalism, 8, justified force and pervasive violence. And then there's a conclusion where I summarize my view, my moral view, and then an epilogue entitled On Anti-Colonialism and the British Future, which reflects on what the hell is going on with anti-colonial or decolonizing history. What are its motives? Because it seems to me that much of the anti-colonialist decolonizing historiography is propelled way beyond the evidence and reason. So the question arises, well, what's propelling it? Because it's not the truth about the past. So that's the form of the book. And here's the guts of the moral argument that appears in the conclusion. So what I say there is, reviewing the 350-year history of British colonial imperial endeavor from 1600 to 1960, thereabouts, stretching from Newfoundland to New Zealand. Not unsurprisingly, it contains lots of evils. And my view is that if you look at the history of any long-standing state, whether imperial or merely national, although most national states of any long-standing have had an imperial phase, look at any long-standing state, you're going to find they've presided over some pretty awful things. So what are the evils that the British Empire involved or contained? And by evils, I mean sometimes culpable injustice or negligence, but also unintended harms. We've got brutal slavery. We've got the epidemic spread of disease. We've got failures to prevent famine, sometimes through culpable incompetence. We've got economic and social disruption, elements of racial alienation and racist contempt, policies of unnecessarily wholesale cultural suppression, the unjust eviction of natives by settlers from land, occasions when colonial governments were too weak to control settler abuse, instances of unjustifiable military aggression, miscarriages of justice, and the failure to admit native talent to the higher echelons of colonial government on terms of equality quickly enough to forestall the buildup of nationalist resentment. So I'm quite frank about the evils of empire, and contrary to what some of my critics continue to say, no, I don't whitewash it. I'm quite frank about the nasty bits of it, the bad bits of it, and I regard all these evils as lamentable, and sometimes, where they're culpable, they merit moral condemnation. But I say, if the imperial ledger has a debit column, it also has a credit column. As I've said earlier, if the empire presided over the slave trade and slavery in the 1600s and 1700s, it was also among the first states in the history of the world to repudiate both. And then in the 19th century and early 20th centuries, it led the world in abolishing slavery from Brazil to Malaysia. The empire also moderated the impact of Western modernity upon very unmodern societies. But one of the roles of colonial government was often to help control and moderate the encounter between European settler and Aboriginal or native. It promoted a worldwide free market, certainly from 1846 until just after the First World War. It was pro-free market, and this sometimes gave native producers and entrepreneurs economic opportunities. Right now, most of Britain's steel industry is owned by an Indian company called Tata. The Tatas built their first textile and steel mills in the 1890s, I think, under the Raj, because they had been able to visit England and see industrial processes there, take back the technology and the expertise, and then build their own factories that then began to outcompete England. The empire also created regional peace by imposing an overarching imperial authority on multiple warring peoples. It had to involve representatives of native peoples in the lower levels of government, simply because in most places, certainly in Africa and India, the number of white European Britons to non-white natives was tiny. In 1900, there were 300 million Indians and a total of 164,000 Britons in India. So if colonial government was to survive at all, it had to depend heavily on native buy-in at various levels. Colonial government often sought to relieve the plight of the rural poor. It provided a civil service and judiciary that was generally and extraordinarily incorrupt. It developed public infrastructure, albeit through private capital, usually. It disseminated modern agricultural methods and medicine. It brought up three of the most prosperous and liberal states now on earth, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. It gave birth to two more, the United States and Israel. It evolved into a loose, consensual, multiracial international organization, the Commonwealth of Nations, which some states that never belonged to the British Empire have opted to join. Mozambique, 1995, Rwanda, 2009. And inspired by the ideal of the Commonwealth, it helped to plan and realize first the League of Nations and then the United Nations. And through the wartime anti-fascist alliance of 1939 to 45, the empire evolved into an important part of the post-war Western alliance against Soviet and Chinese communism, and still has a significant afterlife in the Western military alliance of NATO and the intelligence alliance of the so-called Five Eyes. All right, so what I do is we've got a list of evils and a list of goods. Which weighs more heavily? To which my answer is, we can't tell. Because the goods and evils involved are of such different kinds, we can't measure them together. How much chalk is worth so much cheese? How much racism is worth so much immunization against disease? How many unjustly killed people are worth the blessings of imperial imposed peace? How much anti-slavery would make up for slavery? I think just to ask the questions exposes the absurdity of attempting to answer them. So I don't think if utilitarian calculations work anywhere, and they might work in very simple cases, they just don't work here. So that's the first step of my argument. And the second step is this. Given that all kinds of human rule produce a mixture of good and evil, the Nazis built autobahns in Germany, that was good. The fascists made the trains run on time in Italy, that was good. Does it follow, therefore, that the moral difference between different polities is only ever a matter of degree? Nazi Germany was only slightly worse than the British Empire. Is it true we can't judge any of them to be, all things considered, or centrally wrong, evil? And I say, no, it doesn't mean that. It seems to me we can try to discern central values or principles that were consistently expressed and concordant goals that were earnestly pursued and realized more or less. And if these values, principles, and goals were gravely evil and immoral, then we can say that this rule, this national rule, this imperial rule was systemically unjust. And if it wasn't systemically unjust, then we can say it was systemically just more or less. Now, the obvious candidate for a systemically unjust regime is, of course, that of Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, dominated by the mind of one man. Its view of the world was violently racist, and its aggressive expansionist nationalism unburdened by moral scruple. And the fact that the Nazis pursued the final solution in the middle of a world war, having invaded the Soviet Union, and diverting resources from the war effort to the final solution, indicates just how central this massively murderous racist project was to the nature of the regime. So it's no accident then that contemporary anti-colonialists, decolonizers try very hard to assimilate or identify the British Empire with Nazism, because if the British Empire were equivalent to Nazism, then we can say that it was essentially evil. It doesn't matter how many bridges the British built in India. It doesn't make up for the central evil heart of the thing. And that's why we get claims of colonial genocide in 1830s Tasmania and 1890s Matabeleland. We get claims of racist callousness towards starving natives in the Western Plains of Canada in the 1880s, of crimes against humanity in 1897 Benin, of concentration camps in South Africa and Kenya in the 1900s, and Kenya in the 1950s. So there's the second stage of my argument is to ask, was the British Empire equivalent to Nazism? Was, as the black historian here has recently claimed, was Winston Churchill equivalent to Hitler? And my book argues, no. The British Empire, there's nothing in the British Empire that is can be sensibly likened to or identified with Nazism. I do not regard the empire as essentially racist or essentially given to gross violence or essentially even economically exploitative. So that's the second part of my argument. But is that all we can say? It wasn't Nazi. No, we can say more than that. And here's the third part of the argument. We can observe that from the early 19th century onwards, the empire was significantly moved by genuine humanitarian concerns for oppressed peoples. So I mentioned the movement for the abolition of slavery. After slavery was abolished, Britain sought to pressure European nations and the United States and Brazil to join it in suppressing slavery. In the 1820s and 30s, the Slave Trade Department was the largest unit in the British Foreign Office. So it begins with the abolition of slavery, and I do think there was a kind of revolution in moral attitudes in the late 1700s in Britain, and of course similarly in New England and then the US, because after that there appears to be a concern for native peoples in the way there wasn't so much before then. And what starts off with the abolition of slavery then expands into a general concern for the impact of European settlement upon natives in Australia and New Zealand and North America. And in 1837, you have the foundation of the Society for the Protection of Aboriginal Peoples. So you have this growing humanitarian concern, which does use imperial power to come to the aid of native peoples, and that remains a consistent theme in imperial policy. And the goal developed in Canada and even South Africa and Australia and New Zealand. The goal was the eventual full integration of native peoples into European society as equal citizens. So in South Africa's Cape Colony, Black Africans were granted the vote in the same terms as whites in 1853. In New Zealand, Maori were granted it in 1867, and we're talking about men here, I'm afraid, not women, of course. And in Eastern Canada, all native Canadians were granted the vote in 1885. Unfortunately, 10 years later, the Liberal Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier revoked the vote from Canadian Indians. Why? Because they were all voting Conservative. So you have this growing humanitarian concern. Allied to that, and this is the fourth step of my argument, you also have liberal traditions and institutions of free speech and political criticism that gave the empire in general, as Lewis Gann and Peter Dagnan have written, a built-in capacity for self-criticism. And they write further, and I quote, future historians will necessarily draw on the material accumulated by commissions of inquiry, parliamentary debates, metropolitan blue books, and similar records, which form part of a self-corrective mechanism of a type unknown to earlier Matabele, Somali, or Arab conquerors. They played an important part in putting stop to imperial abuses, end of quote. And allied to this, or part of the liberal character of the empire, was the goal of ultimate self-government. And this was something the empire learned from you lot in America. It learnt that Britain could not keep tight control over far-flung colonies, or if it tried, it was likely to lose them. And so in around 1820, for example, all of the three main city ports in India that the East India Company had built up were governed by Scotsmen, and every single one of them can be found to write that the British presence in India could not be permanent, and what the British should aim to do was to enable Indians to govern themselves decently enough and then withdraw with a good grace and with a good will. And one of them, Sir John Malcolm, a remarkable man born about 60 miles east of where I was born in Scotland. He was one of 17 children. His father was a tenant farmer, couldn't afford to feed his kids. So age of 10, John Malcolm leaves home, goes to London, joins the Madras Army of the East India Company. Age 11, sails to India, stays there for 3 or 4 decades, learns Farsi, leads 3 embassies to the Shah of Persia, writes a 2-volume history of Persia that Goethe is recorded as taking out of the Weimar State Library twice, and that is sufficiently valuable for Cambridge University Press to republish 10 years ago. In 1823, Malcolm wrote this, quote, and he's addressing junior officers in the East India Company, "Let us therefore calmly proceed on a course of gradual improvement, and when our rule ceases, for cease it must, though probably at a remote period, as the natural consequence of our success in the diffusion of knowledge, we shall as a nation have the proud boast that we have preferred the civilization to the continued subjection of India." And this idea of the empire evolving into a voluntary commonwealth of nations was first expressed by Jan Smuts of South Africa in 1917. By 1930, Canada, South Africa, Australia, New Zealand had become effectively self-governing, and after 1919, India was on the same track. Now, I'm simplifying here. Yes, of course, there were forces and pressures moving against the increasing independence of the constituent parts of the empire. Indeed, in the first couple of decades of the 1900s, there was an attempt to create greater imperial cohesion between Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand along American federal lines, which failed because none of the constituent parts wanted to be integrated. They wanted greater independence. So the fourth step of my argument is that there was a considerable set of liberal elements in the empire of various kinds. And then the fifth step is to say that the imperial centrality of the humanitarian and liberal impulses was demonstrated when, in 1939, the British Empire, not just Britain, committed itself to oppose the massively murderous racist regime in Nazi Germany, and when between May 1940, with the fall of France, and June 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the British Empire offered the only military resistance to Nazism, with the sole exception of Greece. So there you have the argument in a nutshell, and it's now I've been going on for about 35-40 minutes, so I could talk about the reception of the book, but if you want to ask me about that, you can. I think I'll stop there and let you ask questions.
Thank you, Nigel. We have 2 questions for now. The first by Deirdre, and then John Cochran.
I'm extremely impressed. Can you hear me?
Yes, I
We
can.
can hear you.
I'm an economist and historian of Britain and now of the world, and so I've been on the edge of these debates about slavery and the British Empire and so forth for a long time, but on the edge. And as far as I can see, I agree with this substance of your characterization of the empire. I've gotten mildly involved in the argument about the centrality of slavery to capitalism, as it's unfortunately called, and have said that that's wrong too. Here's my question. You're an ethicist. I'm an ethicist. I wrote a book in 2006 called the Bourgeois Virtues, and I'm an Anglican. We have to call ourselves Episcopalian in the United States. I'm very interested in the structure of the ethical argument. And what I didn't hear in your talk, although I'll certainly read your book, is why in 2023 there ought to be guilt by the descendants of the empire. The point being that contrary to the some passages in our shared Bible, the guilt of the fathers should not be visited on the sons. And this is a rather important argument, even in economics, because the whole question of what the national debt has to do with the relationship, which of course is intimate in a way between the past and the future. But from the ethical point of view, I just don't see why we should be attacking David Hume, or and that's one way of looking at the question I'm asking. The other is the madness of reparations. As you said, and I think it's a sound way to start. History is filled with exploitation and evil. And you did not mention Ireland and all this, but of course that's the one of the early imperialisms of England and Scotland and Wales, for that matter. Let's see. We would have to be repairing everything constantly.
Yeah.
Everyone here was born of woman. Women have been exploited and persecuted always. So what, from the ethical point of view, is the point? Are we to take money or from one pocket and put it in the other? So I'd be interested in your thoughts about the current ethical question.
Yeah, really good and central questions there, Deirdre. So first, just on guilt and shame, and I think actually now I would correct myself. I use guilt and shame in the book because I identify myself very strongly as British. I lived in your country for 3 years. I married an American. I came back here very deliberately because this is my country. And so my identification with Britain is quite close. But someone, a friend of mine or acquaintance who's sympathetic to my argument said, well, I don't really feel guilt or shame. And I realized that probably you're right. It's confusing and inappropriate to talk about guilt because I had nothing whatsoever to do with slavery.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure none of my tenant farming Scottish forebears had anything to do with it. And who knows, they may have had something to do with the anti-slavery movement. So guilt is not appropriate here. And no one living in this country has anything to do with that. So what I now say, I'd rather talk about guilt and shame. I talk about admiration and pride. I mean, I admire Wilberforce, and excuse me, admiration and lament. I admire Wilberforce. I lament slavery, but I'm not guilty for it. So that's well observed, and I'd row back from guilt and shame. It's not appropriate. Now, but I guess there is a question. I guess there's a question of whether, if it's the case that Britain's current wealth was built on the backs of slaves, do we owe Jamaica and Barbados cash? And my view on this, and I do say this in the conclusion of my book, I say, okay, the case of Germany's restitution of property to Jews after 1945 makes sense to me, right? So
Me too.
It's clear whose property it was or is, descendants of deceased Jews. It's clear who took it, and the connection between post-war government and the Nazi state was close enough. It's clear who's responsible. Okay, so that's all clear enough. But when you go back 200 years, too much has happened.
Right.
Right. It's not just okay. So the British were involved in slavery, and by the way, so was the rest of the world.
Yeah.
Right. And
so were African kings.
And I was visiting my wife's family in Raleigh, North Carolina in January. I went to the Museum of the State of North Carolina, discovered that in 1860, in the eve of your Civil War, there were 30,000 freed slaves in North Carolina, some of whom kept black slaves of their own.
Yep.
As did escaped slaves in Jamaica. So common was it. So first of all, stop picking on the whites here. And secondly, if we're going to do a kind of accounting, well, you've got to credit the British account with 150 years of anti-imperial endeavor. Don't we get some credit for that?
Yeah.
And then there are things like, according to World Bank data, and this is in an endnote somewhere, in 2020, in terms of literacy, life expectancy, and gross national income in international dollars, Barbados is considerably the post-enslaved Barbados is considerably better off than the one-time enslaving Nigeria.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So the end of my argument then is in these kind of cases, in the case of historic evils, too much has happened to try and untangle it all and apportion blame. By all means, let's address present unjust inequalities. And since Britain can't save the whole world, by all means, let's send development aid to Jamaica and Barbados and not to China.
Yeah.
So that's my line.
Good.
I'll try to be brief with three quick comments. Well, I'm interested by your ethical framework, that you're considering the merits of English colonialism by itself. But of course, isn't the right question the alternative history question? What would have happened if not? What would have happened if the English had not colonized North America? Probably Spain would have, and we'd all be living like Venezuela. What would have happened if no Europeans had colonized America is an interesting thing to think about. Disease, however, might well have colonized America even without us. There was a argument in England whether colonization of India was a good thing or not in the 1800s. What would have happened had the liberals won that debate is an interesting. But I think you can't just ask on its own, was this good or evil? But you have to ask the question, what would have happened otherwise? And alternative history is always fun. A second observation on the guilt and so forth. Yes, indeed. Should Italians be guilty about the Roman Empire and pay reparations to the Tuscans, to the Etruscans? Should the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, be guilty for the Ottoman Empire? Should the Arabians feel guilty and pay reparations for the Arabian Empire? Should your ancestors, should you, Scott, me, Anglo-Saxon, feel bad for what we did to the Celts in about 600 AD? The economic perspective I can offer is this is a negative-sum game. That for 10,000 years, people have been raping, pillaging, and destroying each other, and that more was destroyed than was taken, so that it is impossible to give it all back. Just a sad fact. And the last thing, maybe a little humorous, shouldn't the UK be a little bit guilty for its unmentioned sin? It gave India bureaucratic socialism, freedom, which probably held it back, from which it is only beginning to recover, and probably held it back, certainly relative to China, for example, far more than anything else that they did.
Yes, thank you. No, I agree about the counterfactual. I mean, I did ask myself, what would have happened if the British had not got involved in New Zealand? And the answer is, well, if not the British, then either the French or the Americans, in fact. So I agree with that. Given the ability of European and Western powers in the 19th century to send ships all over the world, Western modernity was going to hit the shores of far-flung places one way or another, in a Dutch ship or a French ship or an American ship or a British ship. So that was going to happen. And the impact was going to be disturbing, because the cultural gap between certainly Bantu Africans or Aboriginal Australians and Europeans in 1800, 1850, 1900 was just vast. So that's well taken. Yes, in my book, I think in an endnote, I report a letter to the London Times that I saw some years ago. I can't find it now, unfortunately, where a former civil servant, a former colonial servant, reports that shortly after independence in Nigeria, he was talking to a minister in the Nigerian government who was pressing him for reparations for colonial wrongdoing, and the colonial diplomat, I take it, was sat there politely and listened, and then when the Nigerian had finished, he said, absolutely, you will have your compensation just as soon as we get ours from the Romans. I assume that's apocryphal, but it's a nice story. Yes, we did bequeath bureaucratic socialism to India. In our defense, all I can say is that Nero could have chosen something else from the British political offerings. He chose that, so that's on him.
Norman?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry about that. That Bloomsbury story is a nasty story, and I'm sorry to hear about it. And I hope that doesn't happen too often in Britain or here, for that matter.
I'm told I got a report recently that Bloomsbury regret what they did, which is good.
Oh, that's good. I really have two questions. One, just a sort of historiographical one. I mean, I read at one point Neil Ferguson's very nice book on empire, and I'm just curious how, rather than how you differentiate your work from those who are anti-empire and knee-jerk about various issues having to do with empire, how you would differentiate your work from his. I mean, obviously, you're interested more in ethical arguments, he more in modernization, economic arguments, but his is a very good book, and it doesn't strike me that there are differences, but I'd like to know if you see them. And the second question really is different. It has to do with the reception, the question of Oxford and the protests of sorts or letters about trying to defund or get rid of your project and that sort of thing. How has that panned out? Is Oxford standing up for you and your colleague and your project? And is Oxford rejecting these things? I mean, Oxford's a complicated institution. I mean, Stanford is too, but I think Oxford's even more complicated. You know, how does that work institutionally? Do you have institutional defenders of obviously the right to explore these issues as you see fit in a scholarly fashion? So those are the two questions. Thank you.
Thank you. To the first, Norman, yes, I read Ferguson's Empire shortly after it was published in 2003 and enjoyed it. I then, after writing my manuscript in 2020, I decided to go back and read Ferguson's book. And, since I'd learned an awful lot about the empire, I didn't know in 2003. And I found myself impressed. I thought this is a good book, still a good book. So Neil and I don't disagree on much. I mean, we may disagree on detail, but the main difference is the one you've noted, that obviously he focuses on economics, and he talks up the economic benefits of empire. But he doesn't whitewash it. He's quite candid about the bad bits. I guess where I go beyond him is to make a moral argument to say, I don't think he doesn't try to say, well, the empire was more good than bad. Although I think the story he tells is overall quite a positive one. Although he doesn't, as an historian, he doesn't judge it. I, as an ethicist, I go one step further. I say, no, okay, well, let's take into account all the good economic effects, but what about the bad stuff? How do we make sense of this? So that's the difference. One other thing I'll mention in terms of what I've written in relation to historiography. There's another historian called Bernard Porter, who has written. He's an expert on British Empire. His famous book, Absent-Minded Imperialists, the thesis is that the British at home were barely influenced at all by their empire, didn't care much about it. But Porter leans to the left, not to the right like Ferguson. I was in a second-hand bookshop a few weeks ago and picked up a short volume, a short, feisty, polemical volume called British Imperial, What the... Quick thing in my Zoom. I have it somewhere there. What the British Empire wasn't, and I read it. Not very long. It's well written, and so here's someone on the left, and actually, what I've written is pretty much like what he writes. So I've got historians on my left and my right who more or less agree with me, which, since I'm not an historian, makes me feel reassured. As for reception here, well, there's basically good news. Very shortly after I was plunged into the culture war here in 2017, was contacted by a member of the university administration who asked to talk with me. He did ask to meet in a place where no one would see us. But then he told me that he reassured me that the top of the university had my back, and I was being fully supported, which was nice to hear. And I think Oxford and the vice chancellor of Oxford, the outgoing one, Louise Richardson, who now works for the Carnegie Foundation in New York, and the present one, Irene Tracy, have both been very explicit in saying, in effect, this is a grown-up university. Students have to be prepared to cope with points of view that they really don't like in an adult, rational fashion. So that's all good. What it doesn't quite address is what I would call forms of illiberal repression further down the institution. So if you Google Biggar, Ethics and Empire, Oxford Centre for Global History, you will see a page where the Oxford Centre, in a sense, repudiates my project. It's been up there for 5-6 years. They've probably forgotten about it. And they did that. They put that notice up there without consulting all of their members. I know because one of them protested. So this was an authoritarian act of repression. And also, John Darwin and I applied for funding to a funding body in the university, and we both thought our application was pretty strong, but it was rejected because I was told, not in writing, I was told that the core group of the project wasn't diverse enough, and we all came from elite universities. So, Norman, the news here is pretty good. I mean, it's no one has stopped me. I've survived that, and the institution as such has allowed me to get on with it. But the pressure was such on John Darwin that he jumped ship within 4 days of the row breaking. And apparently I'm a pariah among historians in the faculty. Yeah, so it's a mixed story.
John Staden.
Hi, thank you, Nigel, for a great book. I really enjoyed it. I'll say hello to your wife. I'm here in North Carolina. I'm going to say hello to you as a fellow Brit. I have a little bit of colonial experience. In the 50s, I was in a very low position in what was then Northern Rhodesia, working for something called the Health and Nutrition Scheme. The Health and Nutrition Scheme was funded by the British government. It was funded by the Northern Rhodesia government, de facto the British government. And its aim was to improve health and nutrition among Africans. It had absolutely no relevance to Europeans at all. The two conditions that we studied were parasitic infections and malnutrition, and neither of which were a problem for the Brits. So this is a totally altruistic thing. The other point is about reparations. On the face of it, it's absurd to reward people who didn't suffer from a problem by taking money from people who didn't cause the problem. I mean, it's obviously nonsense. And I suppose the response to that is, well, African Americans now are indeed suffering. Well, the counter to that I read first in a book by a chap called Keith Richburg, who is an African American journalist. And he pointed out an interesting counterfactual, which I've not seen repeated very much, maybe not at all, which is that if slaves had not been brought to North America, then they would have grown up in West Africa, and their descendants today would be a great deal worse off than the descendants of the slaves who grew up in North America. And I wonder why that hasn't gotten a bit of traction. I mean, in other words, if you're going to compensate people for something, it's got to be compared to what? And if it's compared to that, if it's compared to living in rural Nigeria or something, well, then there's nothing to compensate. And I wonder what your reaction might be to that.
Just on your first point, John, I mean, I've spoken to quite a number of ex colonial district officers or people involved in Africa and African colonies in the 1950s, and they report much the same as you. And I think there's no doubt that as Marjorie Perham, the doyenne of African colonies in the 50s and 60s, wrote in her book A Colonial Reckoning, I pinched the title a bit. She talked about a progress in virtue in the British colonial empire. And one thing that I didn't realize until I began reading this stuff was that in Africa, with the exception of South Africa, the British and indeed the other European countries were in Africa for one lifetime, from 1890 to 1960. There wasn't much time. And then in 1923, I think, the Colonial Office issued a statement saying that henceforth, colonial government will be for the betterment of Africans. And of course, before then, states generally were not big into welfare, and economic development was a private business. It wasn't really states weren't big into promoting I guess economic development. But in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, colonial governments in Africa became much more involved in self-conscious development, and it was understood that this was going to issue eventually in the creation of independent states. According to Perham, and others would say so too now, it happened too quickly, but the forces were such they couldn't be resisted. So on that, and then secondly, the argument about had the slaves not, had the Africans not been transported to the West Indies and the Carolinas and the eastern seaboard of the States, they would have languished in West Africa. I did actually make that point in a newspaper article for the Telegraph newspaper, the conservative paper here, and to my astonishment, they wanted it taken out. Wow. I didn't press them. I just thought that I guess I got the impression they thought that was going to be too inflammatory. But it's entirely true, and I'd actually make a more inflammatory remark if I dared to, which is, I think it's a practical certainty that some of the men who found themselves captured in slave raiding by other Africans and then sold to European traders and transported across the Atlantic, some of them would themselves have been involved in slave raiding. It's just that fortune turned upon them, and they ended up being captured rather than capturing. And had they stayed in some parts of West Africa as slaves, some of them, probably not many, but some of them would have ended up being buried alive as human sacrifices when their chief died. Yeah, so I think that's true, but even a conservative paper in this country finds it too incendiary to state.
Well, perhaps if you tell them that the argument was first made by a black journalist, they might have been somewhat swayed. His name is Keith Richburg is the name. I forgotten the title of his book. It came out 10 or 15 years ago, but it's there. He's a that's rhetorical, quite useful. Yeah, thank you.
Nabil Anajar. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself.
Nabil Anajar, Northwestern University. Really enjoyed your talk. I just want to start with a personal comment and then I have a question. I'm originally from Iraq, and Iraq was dominated by the British Empire for about 35-year period. And I think my personal story is very much in line with the two sides of the ledger that you indicated, more on the right side. Both my parents went to universities in the early 50s. They were the first in their families. The universities at that time were actually some of the best in the region. And that really very much shaped my life and the life of my siblings. And and so on. So I think there's a lot to be said for this. And of course, the argument is always, with all the issues or the problems, always compared to what? Compared to the Ottomans that dominated Iraq before the entry of the British and the First World War, or to the series of coups and military dictatorship and genocidal regime that followed, right?
No.
So this is just a personal example in support with what you said. My question is, we also know a lot about the history of the Spanish Empire, the French Empire, the Russians, the Ottomans, the list goes on and on. And you said you are a proud Englishman, or
Britain.
Right. And so, for somebody like me from the outside, I don't see the French or the Russians or the Turks going through these self-doubt and self-criticism and destroying their monuments and their history and negating what they stood for and so on. So as an outsider, I look at this and say, what is wrong with these people? And this is a phenomenon that I find basically in English-speaking countries, right? So the United States, the United Kingdom, and some of the other countries. So what is your insight about this? Why France and Italy and, do not suffer from the same?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question, Nabil. As far as I can tell, European countries that had overseas colonial empires do suffer a bit from it, but not on the same scale. So there have been controversies in Belgium about, I think they have a museum of colonial history, and of course the very bad example of King Leopold's involvement in the Congo is on their conscience. The Dutch, well, there was a poll a few years ago, and apparently the Dutch are the most proud of their empire. So the Dutch, being Dutch, are pretty robust. So, interestingly, the only to date, the only non-English speaking country where a publisher has bought the rights to my book is Portugal. So it must be an issue there. But you're quite right. It's the English-speaking countries that are most prey to this decolonizing panic. Why? Well, my American friends, it's all your fault because we share a common language, and you guys are culturally dominant. And let me be clear, in many respects, I'm very happy to be dominated culturally by America. You produce some very good things. But what that means is the British media takes far more interest in American politics than it does in European ones. Even when we belonged to the EU, that was true. Far more interest. And so what happened, and we didn't, there was a bit of decolonizing activity before 2020, but it was George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, that sped across the Atlantic, landed here, was taken up by anti-racist lobby groups and the left, and immediately translated into a war on colonization and whatever, a decolonizing narrative and all that stuff. So it was an American import, then it was exploited by left-wing lobby groups. And why were they successful? A couple of reasons. One is most British people know nothing about their imperial history at all, almost nothing. So that they didn't know, most of them didn't know enough to counter some of the nonsense. And when black people tell you that you're systemically racist, it's quite hard for white people to contradict them. I mean, some white people like me might, but most white people feel cowed. Happily, in 2021, there was report produced by a government commission on race and ethnic disparities. 9 out of 10 commissioners were not white, and the report said, no, Britain is not systemically racist, although it may contain elements of racism and institutional racism. But in fact, Britain's come a long way in the last 50 years. As anyone viewing the skin color of our Prime Minister, and indeed the skin color of most of the Secretaries of State in the previous Boris Johnson government, who were not white. One of them was Iraqi, Nadim Zahawi. But this narrative that Britain is systemically racist has been widely accepted, and that's why universities and museums are busy decolonizing. It is depressingly thoughtless, and for universities to be so uncritical, but it is really dismaying. But it betokens an ignorance and a terrible fear of being considered racist. But the good news is, the CRED report came out in 2021, and in the last 3 weeks, there have been 3 books published by Black Britons, one of them by a 27-something-year-old from Nigeria, Tomiwa Owolade, and the book is entitled, "This is Not America." So I think, we must take responsibility for being so gullible and craven, but it was the translation of BLM across the Atlantic, I think, that has exacerbated the problem.
Just like one quick follow-up is that the George Floyd episode was also seen in France, and France has a long colonial history.
Okay.
Arguably in many ways more brutal than the British history, and so I didn't see anything remotely similar to that reaction, or in Spain or others, right? And the other thing also about the decolonization movement, this has long roots in the 80s at least, and 90s, with critical theory of colonialism and so on and so forth. So maybe it just surfaced to this fullest strength in 2020, but this has probably at least 3-4 decades before, I think, if not more.
You're absolutely right. And I read a book by the conservative French philosopher Pascal Bruckner called "The Tyranny of Guilt," and I inferred from that France did have a controversy about this in the noughties. Yes, it goes way back, but the question that needs to be answered, and I've tried to answer it, and you've countered it a bit, is why did decolonization move from the margins to the center so quickly in the last 3 or 4 years? I mean, we had Rhodes Must Fall coming from South Africa in 2015 here, but that didn't gain the kind of traction that decolonization has gained since. So it's something to do with Black Lives Matter. Why that had an impact in Britain it didn't have in France is a very good question. I don't know the answer to that, but there's a photograph I saw on Twitter of an English Black Lives Matter protest, and there was a woman standing there with a placard saying, "Disarm the police." British police aren't armed. They are in America, not here. But she was standing there in England with this thing. What on earth is going on?
Okay, we have a question. Eric?
I'm so tempted to answer the last question with an economic model, but I'll just say the word cascades. But I want to ask a practical question. I liked your talk, and it was so stimulating that I'm going to put in the chat now 1 quote and 2 aphorisms, which if my question is too boring, you can look at. My question, though, is about the book contract, because it sounds very much like Alex Burns' situation with Oxford University Press and his pronouns book. I don't know if you've talked to him or know of Alex Byrne from MIT. He had a book, it was accepted. He sent in the first chapter. By then, pronouns had become more than just a philosophic issue, and they said, external reviewers like it, but we're not going to publish it. He got it published somewhere else anyway. But suppose you didn't, or even now, could you sue for breach of contract and get 5 months of royalties from Bloomsbury Press? Or did you know what your contract said about that?
Good question, Eric. Well, I did actually, because as I say, I wasn't willing to let Bloomsbury get off the hook. I paid $800 to a lawyer to tell me whether I could hold to my contract? The answer was no. There was a clause in the contract which in effect allowed them, I forget what the terms were, it in effect allowed them almost any reason to pull out. Now what I don't know is whether that's a common clause. And next time I sign a contract, I'll check on that.
Would you be willing to make that public? I love seeing contracts.
Fine.
And
So,
I like being warned too.
Sure. So Eric, if you can get my email address, and Ivan has it, send me an email and I'll go and hunt down what my lawyer said and what which clause in the contract it was. Yeah. So no, in my case, I couldn't do anything.
I've written
Yes.
quite a few books, and those contracts are completely meaningless
Really?
on either side.
Hmm.
Either the author or the publisher can easily just walk away from it.
So that's normal in your experience,
Yes,
David?
it is completely normal in both Britain and the United States.
Huh. If only authors knew that.
Stefan.
Yeah, hi, Stefan. I'm economist at Emory. I just wanted to contribute to that discussion, which I think is really like the core discussion, we should be having as to like, why is that happening now? And why does it not happen in France? And France, actually, the decolonization literature topic is actually very old. So Frantz Fanon is sort of famously, if you speak with any left-wing activists, is sort of famously at the start of the decolonization literature, was like a French intellectual from Martinique, I think. And he was supported by Sartre very prominently. But then I think the French society took a very different turn, and I don't know when that happened exactly, but let's say in the 80s or 90s. So I think in a way, the topic comes up now has more to do with like a certain type of like neo-Marxist left-wing theory just spreading currently in the English-speaking world. And actually also in my original homeland, Germany, I find like it's very parallel. But I don't see like quite the same thing in places like France or I mean, I think there are elements of it, but it's clearly not as strong. So I think it's almost in a way the topic. I'm not saying it's an immaterial topic, but I think the specific issue that these type of left-wing activists focus on is sort of almost random, or like, it could have been like any other topic, could have been a drag, instead of George Floyd, it could have been whatever, like some issues about, like a Catholic protest against drag queen story hours or whatever else, So yes. I don't think there's anything like super important about the decolonization topic for this kind of movement. It's just one of several issues that they raise.
That's interesting. Yeah, but it still leaves unexplained. You talk about the spread of neo-Marxist theory and critical race theory, I guess, is one major expression of it at the moment. Question is why that, and that's, CRT is now orthodoxy very quickly in schools and universities, not universally, but in some places. And again, the question is why here now and so quickly? And I don't quite understand that. One thing I would say is, and I alluded to this at the beginning, there's a distinction between what goes on in universities and what goes on outside universities. So here, with the sole exception of the Guardian newspaper, which leans heavily to the left, most of the press has been taking a skeptical and critical view. And I guess that, if most of the press does that, then that indicates that most of those who read the press probably are inclined to be skeptical and critical. So it's not that the general population swallows this stuff. It is that the people in charge of our institutions swallow it, or University educated people swallow it, or universities swallow it. So there's also a difference. It's been received in different ways by different social groups. And why university graduates or university professors should be more susceptible, I don't know, except that my experience of the culture wars here is that one has led me to the conclusion that one should never underestimate the degree to which fear determines the way academics behave, and nor should you ever overestimate their moral courage. I'm not saying that academics are worse than anyone else, but contrary to their self-perception as fiercely independent thinkers, actually, in my experience, outside their specialisms, academics are perfectly capable of behaving like sheep. I don't know what your experience is, but so yeah, I mean, I'm still left. I mean, given Nabil's observation, this stuff doesn't play quite so fiercely in the likes of France, even though George Floyd was widely reported there. It still leaves me puzzled as to why we are so susceptible. Although I think Canada probably appears to be, in terms of, to use the unscientific term of wokery, and in terms of decolonization, Canada is several stages more sick than Britain.
Okay, so thank you very much, Nigel, for a great talk. Thank you, everybody. We're going to take a break in terms of seminars in the summer, and I think we will resume by July 27 with Michael Schellenberger, who will talk about the war on free speech, how it hurts us all. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.